An American science historian believes the political uncertainty surrounding climate change in the United States has sprouted from the views of just a handful of distinguished scientists. Professor Naomi Oreskes claims the group also denied the science linking tobacco smoke to cancer and was sceptical about acid rain and the hole in the ozone layer. She's in Australia to promote her book Merchants of Doubt, and she spoke to Margot O'Neill.
50 million times a day, Australians light up and like it.
Tobacco industry documents dating back to the 1950s show that companies adopted a strategy of always questioning the science linking their products to cancer in a bid to stave off government regulation. In 2006, the industry was found guilty of a criminal pattern of fraud. But for half a century, its tactic worked, especially when some distinguished physicists lent their support. That's according to University of California Professor Naomi Oreskes.
The U.S. Congress only voted last year in 2009 to give the Food and Drug Administration the authority to regulate tobacco as a harmful drug, even though we have known since the 1950s, actually arguably even earlier, but we've known since the 1950s that tobacco caused cancer, and we've known at least since the 1960s that nicotine was an addictive drug.
Professor Oreskes says that over the decades, a small group of eminent, politically influential physicists, most of them famous for their work on the atomic bomb and Cold War weapon systems, joined forces to beat back a rising tide of environmental regulation. They variously opposed action on acid rain, the ozone hole, and most recently climate change, by continually raising doubts about whether the science was certain enough to warrant action. But how is it possible that just a handful of scientists have been able to obscure the truth when there are thousands of other scientists saying the opposite? It sounds almost like a conspiracy theory.
All of these other thousands of scientists actually don't have the same kind of political access. And this is a really important part of the story and its historical roots in the Cold War, because these were the men who helped build the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb, rocketry, the rockets that took men to the moon, the entire ballistic missile system. And because of this seminal contribution they had made in the Cold War, they were very, very powerful people. They knew senators, they knew congressmen, they knew admirals, they knew generals, and they knew the President of the United States.
These were very eminent scientists. Why would they do this?
It's part of this whole ideological program of challenging any science that could lead to government regulation, because it's part of an ideological conviction that all regulation is bad, that any time the government steps in to protect us from harm, that we're on the slippery slope to socialism. And this is the ideology that you see underlying a kind of almost paranoid anti-communism. So even after the Cold War is over, these people are seeing reds under the bed.
The physicists included Dr. Frederick Seitz, now deceased, who was a former president of the US National Academy of Sciences and a science advisor to the US President and NATO, along with physicist Dr. Robert Jastrow and Dr. William Nuremberg, also both deceased. They founded the George C. Marshall Institute, a conservative think tank originally established to defend the failed Strategic Defence Initiative under former President Ronald Reagan, known as Star Wars. The main targets of their campaigns were politicians and journalists.
One of the things that they did, and we document this throughout the story, is a systematic pressuring of the media to give equal time to their side of the story. And it begins with strategic defense, which is very interesting because the vast majority of American scientists were opposed to Star Wars. 6,500 American scientists and engineers had signed a petition saying that they would not accept funds from the Strategic Defense Program. Jastrow, Nuremberg, and Seitz, three men, disagreed with that, but because they were powerful and influential, they were able to get their views to be given equal time by the press. When the press did not give equal time for their views, they would threaten them.
The president of the Marshall Institute, Jeff Cooter, who is not a scientist, said Professor Oreskes is involved in character assassination of the Institute's founding scientists.
Jastrow, Seitz, and Nuremberg, the three men talked about in her book, the founders of this institute, were great American scientists who were motivated by the contributions that science had made to public policy, that had made to the great United States.
Jeff Cooter also denied the Institute was against action to combat global warming, although it opposes sharp reductions in carbon pollution, claiming climate science remains too uncertain.
In our view, the science doesn't support actions as radical as that. It supports other kinds of actions that hedge risk that recognize uncertainty, that puts you in a position to harness technology and innovation at a time that will mature at a time when it's appropriate and when your energy systems require it. The climate's always changing. Temperatures will rise and fall both on a worldwide basis and on a regional basis. Attributing a cause to that is a tricky question and one that the science cannot do.
Well, of course, they've been saying that for 22 years, that it's too soon, it's always too soon, just like the tobacco industry always said it was always too soon to regulate tobacco. And what we saw with the tobacco industry is it took half a century to get the regulation that we should have had, in the 1950s or 60s. And in the meanwhile, millions of people died from tobacco-related diseases.
Professor Oreskes says the continuing exaggeration of climate science uncertainty already means the US has lost 2 decades to develop new technology to decarbonise society and slow global warming. Margot O'Neill, Lateline.